Hi, folks. I think we're going to get started. Hi, can I have your attention? I'm going to start off with a public service announcement. Someone left their keys upstairs. If these are your keys. Yeah. Anybody? No? Oh, goodness. Somebody's not getting home today. All right. Well, hello. My name is Jennifer Kilmer. I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Washington State Historical Society at this time. I want to welcome everyone. Oh, thank you. I want to welcome you all to this day of programs focused on the Boldt Decision at 50 years. I want to begin by saying that we are all sitting on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people who have stewarded this land across the generations. They are a sovereign nation, and we honor their elders past and present. If there is a member of the Puyallup tribe who would like to welcome folks today, I would invite you to come up. Ramona, would you like to say anything? No? You don't?
Well, there's a book coming out. Everybody should buy it when it comes out from the University of Washington Press.
Well, there we go. How's that? How's that for a welcome? Everybody buy Ramona's book.
Is it out? Is it out yet?
Is it? I don't know.
When does it come out?
Well, they were saying the end of the year, but I think because of the
Boldt 50?
interest everybody has in Osage, they'll probably speed it up because there's
Okay. Just look for the name. I also want to recognize our distinguished guest today, Chairman Willie Frank of the Nisqually Tribe, and former Chairman and Council Member Jim Peters of the Squaxin Island Tribe. You will be hearing from them later today at 2 o'clock during our panel discussion, but we want to welcome you today. Thanks for being here. I also want to acknowledge that there are several family members of Judge George Boldt who are in attendance today, so thank you for being here. Yes, would you like to stand up? Family members? Excellent. So the Washington State Historical Society is able to do what we do thanks to support from our members, our donors, and from some very generous institutions, including Arts Fund, Umpqua Bank, Humanities Washington, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, the Pendleton and Elizabeth Carey Miller Charitable Foundation, and Cascade Public Media at this time. And today's programming is also made possible by a grant from the City of Tacoma through their Heritage Grant program. So we want to thank them for their support. I also want to thank all of our partners for the activities that are happening today, our friends at the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, the Nisqually Indian Tribe, the Squaxin Island Tribe, as well as our partners that include Dr. Lori Arnold from Gonzaga University, Legacy Washington, the Billy Frank Jr. National Wildlife Refuge, University of Washington Press, Sky Bear Media, and Off the Res Catering. How's the food?
Amazing.
Good? Good, excellent. Okay, enough of me. I am very excited to introduce our speakers today. I'm going to go in reverse order. At the end of the program, you're going to hear from Ed Eckley, who's an oral historian with the Legacy Washington Project since 2023. He holds an MA in history from Western Washington University with an emphasis on Pacific Northwest labor and immigration. And he's previously worked as a freelance historical researcher and writer. And his past projects include oral histories of the Alaska Salmon Cannery Union reformers, exhibit work with the Wingaluk Museum in Seattle, and historical reports and interpretive displays for public agencies, including serving as executive director of the Bigelow House Museum in Olympia. He's also a contributing author at historylink.org. Next, we have, first you will hear from John Hughes, who is our featured speaker today. He is historian for the Office of the Secretary of State since 2008, chief historian, I should say. And he was previously editor and publisher of the Daily World in Aberdeen. John Hughes personally knows everyone who has ever lived in Aberdeen. He is an award-winning investigative reporter and historian. He has received the June Anderson Almquist Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Professional Journalists in 2004. He's an alumnus of the University of Puget Sound and the University of Maryland, and a trustee of the Washington State Historical Society, and we are so lucky to have him on board. Now with Lightning Bolt, he is the author of 15 books on Northwest history, including Booth Who, a biography of Governor Booth Gardner, and Slade Gorton, a half-century in politics. His biography of Congresswoman Julia Butler Hanson is now in its second printing, and he also edited the autobiography of Daniel J. Evans, our former three-term governor and U.S. Senator. With that, here's John Hughes.
You know, the best thing about people who were so alive when they were alive is that when they're gone, they're really still here. You can see their smiles. You can hear their voices. They're here. I grew up in a labor union family in Aberdeen, and early on we learned a folk song about Joe Hill, the labor martyr. And it goes like this. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says Joe, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. Judge Boldt's gone, but his legacy is palpable. It's alive as you and me. It's in this room with his family. And 50 years on, it lives and it breathes because a great judge stood up for justice. Yet the challenge to preserve and protect and enhance an endangered resource is more formidable than ever. The marine food chain is under constant attack, and our salmon and our steelhead are more than iconic. They're more than latter-day canaries in a coal mine. They're a sacred trust, as you've heard earlier when we shared stories that date back eons in indigenous people tradition. My strength is from the fish. A Yakima chief told the court in 1916, my blood is from the fish. My strength is from the fish. My blood is from the fish. In the spring of 1855, when Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens met with tribal leaders in the Walla Walla Valley, he promised that the great chief, none other than the President of the United States and the members of the United States Senate who would ratify a treaty, were men of their word. Chief Kamayakan of the Yakimas had a response. Your chiefs are good, he said. Your chiefs are good. Perhaps you have spoken straight, that your children will do what is right. Let them do as they say. Let them do as they have promised. That is all I have to say. Think of those words again. So often we romanticize the remarks through translators of what indigenous peoples had to say at this time. And historians are skeptical of some of those statements, but this one absolutely just is so imbued with authenticity in the spirit of what it meant to be a people of this land, the original people of this land. Let them do as they have promised. That is all I have to say. 100 years later, United States Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black italicized that litmus test of national integrity, doing as you say. Great nations, like great men, should keep their word. What a wonderful nutshell that is. Great nations, like great men, should keep their word. It's the shortest, most eloquent, most indelible summary there is of the Boldt Decision. Great nations, like great men, should keep their word. What a concept. And yet Isaac Stevens broke those treaties, many of those treaties, before the ink was hardly dry. It speaks volumes about who Judge Boldt really was. He believed in the rule of law. He believed solemn promises were meant to be kept. And we're really honored today again to remember that with us is Judge Boldt's remarkable daughter, Jenny Riedinger, together with her daughter, Emily, and other members of the family. I could not have written this book without Emily and without Jenny. Jenny's carefully preserved and annotated trove of family photos, letters, documents allowed me to create a revealing portrait of her father's character. Imagine this, as historians, we're always yearning for primary sources that really give us the actual words or the insight of the subjects. With the case of Julia Butler Hansen, I found that she had kept a diary since grade school all through her last years in Congress. In the case of Judge Boldt, he had saved clippings from the trial and annotated them on the edges, like completely misleading, full of bunk. I mean, it was really remarkable. But one of his prized possessions was a note that accompanied a bouquet from the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. And this is what Billy Frank Jr. wrote. Dear Judge Boldt, this will be the greatest Independence Day ever for Indian people in the great Northwest. You are a great judge for the Indians and the resource. Billy's gone, but he's seemingly more alive than ever. He was arrested the first time at 14 by a game warden who pushed his face into the mud. Despite, as he put it, being chased and tear gassed, tackled, punched, handcuffed, dragged soaking wet to the county jail, 40 arrests in all, his manner was still courteous. Soon a statue of a Nisqually fisherman from Frank's Landing will join America's Hall of Heroes. What could be more fitting? Billy's gone, but Willie's here. His parents' flesh, blood, and spirit carrying on. Joe Dela Cruz and Hank Adams, two people I knew so well from my days as a young reporter covering the Quinaults, two tireless champions of tribal sovereignty. They're gone. Joe's been elevated to the National Native American Hall of Fame, where Hank, beyond a doubt, belongs as well, though neither of them would be happy to discover no smoking signs. But a highlight for me today and any other occasion like this is that with us today is as brave and intrepid a warrior as there ever was, who's carrying on, and that is Ramona Bennett. Ramona, thank you. I have to tell you that Linda Mates, the environment reporter for the Seattle Times, is a dear friend of mine. We were comparing notes about Ramona, and Linda said, you must ask Ramona about the tear gas incident. And on that fateful day when fisheries agents and helmeted Tacoma police descended on the encampment, someone pointed a gun straight at Ramona's chest. This has got to be a lead chapter in your book, doesn't it, Ramona? Someone pointed what she thought was a gun right square in the middle of her chest, and she thought that it was going to be over right then and there, but it was a tear gas weapon, and the tear gas canister bounced off her chest, and pretty soon all the Indian fishermen were kicking it around like at an effing soccer game, as Ramona put it so well. I wish Ed Johnstone were here with us, because Ed's carrying on. I'm sure he's back at the commission carrying on. Guy McMines, a Quinault fisherman, fisheries biologist, whose compelling testimony, I would argue, was absolutely key to what Judge Boldt ruled. Guy's gone. We called him Big Butch. He was big. He loomed in my doorway every time he came to visit the Daily World. But Ed, his brother, is doing that job, carrying on. Stan Pitkin, George Dysart, and Al Zients, three absolutely tenacious attorneys who advanced the cause of tribal sovereignty, are gone. But Mason Morissette, who defended the Boldt decision all the way to the United States Supreme Court and won, is here today. Mason, stand up. When you read the transcript of that, it's pretty amazing, because Mason was up against Slade Gorton, and people have said to me, is it cognitive dissonance that you could have done a biography of Slade Gorton and helped to do a book about Billy Frank and are now writing about Judge Boldt? Well, many of you in this room recall so vividly that Slade was your most tenacious and skilled adversary, but you will also attest that he was no racist. He harbored the sincere belief that the tribes were only, as he put it, quasi-sovereigns, and advanced that all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But Mason, happily, for those of us who believe in the rule of law and that sovereignty is sovereignty, was there to carry that decision. And it's when you read the transcript, it's pretty amazing stuff. Slade used to boast that he had argued 17 cases before the United States Supreme Court, and each day he was there, the attorneys got to keep a quill, a classic quill like in days of yore, as a souvenir. Slade only lost 2 of those cases. I don't know how many Mason argued. It wasn't 17, but he won the big one. So hats off to you, Mason. And Mason is carrying on, still at it. Happily, Judge Boldt's enormous, indelible legacy is now documented in books, documentary films, lesson plans, and exhibits. Last month, I had a wonderful moment here as a trustee. I looked on as Charlene Kreis, director of the Squaxin Island Museum, which, by the way, is extraordinary. She pointed proudly to her great-great-grandfather's signature, an evocative X, on the Treaty of Medicine Creek. And what a priceless moment it is for us in this institution, in this great museum, to have that document, that landmark document here. If you haven't seen it today, you must make that opportunity. And at our trustees meeting a week ago, we reviewed plans and drawings for a remarkable new exhibit that will document 14,000 years of Indigenous history in Washington. It's going to be really something amazing. Well, the happy thing is that our children and our children's children and their children can now learn the true story of the fight for treaty rights and why the Boldt decision, like Board v. Brown of Education, is a civil rights landmark. Our much missed friend, Charles Wilkinson, wrote an essential overview of tribal sovereignty movement, and I urge you to read it. It's called Treaty Justice. It was shocking to all of us who knew and admired Charles, and we compared notes so often in the past 17 months before his death, untimely death. Happily, he had finished that book just before he died, and we now have it. My friend and former teammate Trovo Heffernan brilliantly portrayed Billy Frank's life story in Where the Salmon Run. We have fresh copies of that downstairs for you. It's remarkable. Those days that Trovo and I spent with your dad were so precious, Willie. And my friends, Bill Wilkerson and Jerry Pugnetti, are here with us today. They offer yet another really important perspective on civility and consensus in their book, which is aptly entitled In Common With. My new friend and teammate, Ed Eckley, you'll hear from later, has written an oral history companion to my biography of Judge Boldt. It's called Confluence, another apt title. It features profiles of Ed Johnstone, Mason Morissette, Charlene Kreis, and several other tribal leaders, as you will hear later. I have to mention, too, Frank Haw, a new friend. I did not meet Frank back in the day, and I'm sorry that I did not read his excellent 2015 book called Washington Sport of Kings before I had finished the Boldt biography, but we're doing a second edition, Frank, and some of your observations are really sage and are going in there. Frank details his long career, his fair-minded career as a fisheries biologist for the state. Well, we're here today because 50 years ago, on February 12, 1974, Lincoln's birthday, federal judge George Hugo Boldt jolted in the Northwest with his landmark decision upholding treaty fishing rights, treaty tribe fishing rights. That day of delayed justice came 117 years after Governor Stevens left office to represent Washington Territory in Congress. Stevens had negotiated in the space of 2 years 10 treaties that provided for the relinquishing of Indian title to 100,000 square miles of land for what amounted to pennies per acre, maybe some chisels and beads thrown in, quite ironically, chisels and beads. As the settlers arrived in ever-increasing numbers, the Indians were already in precipitous decline from diseases for which they had no natural immunity. Another of the white man's blessings to be certain that they were civilized. The fisheries resource, literally and figuratively, their lifeblood, was being decimated with mechanized ingenuity. One of the things I found that still shakes me to the core is an 1892 editorial from the Tacoma Daily Ledger that just absolutely reeks of manifest destiny racism. Here's what the Ledger said. It's satisfactory to know that something finally is being done to investigate and settle the difficulties surrounding the question of what we are to do with our Indian reservations. That they were bestowed at first with far too liberal a hand is beyond dispute. The final disposal of the Indians is only a question of time. Civilization, after all, does not agree with the red man's constitution. Far too liberal a hand. Far too liberal a hand. It really sums up the prevailing contemporary view that the hapless red men were just in the way relics of an uncivilized era. Never mind that they'd been here from time immemorial, at least 14,000 years, carbon dated to a spear point. and that they were at one with nature, careful stewards of the environment, and what are we to say of final disposal? That sounds a lot to me like the final solution. As if it wasn't enough to consign Indians to reservations, kidnap their children, forbid them to speak their languages, forbid them to practice their spirituality, and in general just rinse out all that other pesky Indianness. Now, we wanted them civilized. The publicity generated by my biography of Judge Boldt has generated some calls and letters, I expected them, from non-Indian fishermen who assure me that the Indians took all the fish. And Judge Boldt was an addle-pated pawn in their game. Well, as the saying goes, you're entitled to your own opinion, just not your own facts. Who took all or most of the fish is not in doubt. In the 1880s, riverfront canneries began sprouting like dandelions from Bellingham to Astoria. With new rail lines to expedite shipments, the non-Indian commercial fishery grew exponentially. The Columbia River's 55 canneries, their ghostly pilings are still visible if you drive between Nacelle and Astoria today, filled 30.2 million one-pound cans of salmon in 1883. And on Puget Sound, there were 3 canneries in 1894 and 24 in 1905. Ed and I found a postcard from the turn of the century that shows a day's catch, 80,000 gorgeous salmon slithering on a cannery floor on Grace Harbor, about 3 blocks from where I live. 80,000, one day's catch. Non-Indian commercial fishing on the Columbia River utilized gill nets, seines, traps, and beginning in 1879, something they called fish wheels. They were powered by the downstream rush of the river. Baskets attached to the wheels. Paddles scooped up migrating salmon with just ruthless efficiency. And now we fast forward to the 1930s, to the era of the great dams on the Columbia, to electrify homes, irrigate dry land, and produce aluminum for the B-17s that helped win the war. Well and good. Unfortunately, the fate of the fish and the people for whom they were sacred were collateral damage, an afterthought. No fish ladders on the Grand Coulee. No fish ladders on the Grand Coulee Dam, the greatest wonder of the world. Meanwhile, some reservation homes, including on the Puyallup and Nisqually and Tahola, were still without electricity as late as the 1960s. So much for progress. And what I saw in 1966 when Joe Delacruz and Guy McMines and Jug Jackson of the Quinaults took me on my first tour of Quinault lands was slash and burn overcutting that had just decimated tribal forest lands. Streams and rivers were clogged with debris. The impact on that habitat is still being felt today. So, the Indians took all the fish. Well, between 1858 and 1987, according to state reports, non-Indian commercial fishermen in Washington state harvested 81.3% of the salmon. Sports fishermen got 12.2%. And by my math, and by the state's math, that left 6.5% for the Indians. Never mind that tribal fisheries biologists, easily the equal of the states, had already warned that overfishing, dams, predation, and even then the telltale early signs of climate change were jeopardizing the resource. By 1973, when the treaty rights trial got underway, the annual tribal catch was estimated at 2%. 2%. U.S. Attorney Stan Pitkin, who got a snoot full of tear gas with Ramona on that fateful day underneath that railroad bridge, called his case a case to end all cases. It was time, finally, for the United States government to realize that it had made solemn promises to sovereign people. One of the ironies is that in 1973, tribal activists and many of their attorneys had worried that Judge Boldt was far too conservative to grasp what seemed to them to be a fundamental truth. The treaties that signed by Stevens, affirmed by the United States Congress in the 1850s, were still solemn promises to be kept in a modern world. The tribes feared that central casting had just dropped a hard-nosed old conservative into a milieu of militant Indians and their celebrity supporters like Marlon Brando. Earlier, when the Justice Department sent Judge Boldt to Philadelphia to clear a backlog of cases, lawyers there dubbed him Lightning Bolt because there was no dilly-dallying in his court. He threw the book at celebrity gangsters and corrupt union leaders, sending Dave Beck, the Teamsters boss, famously to McNeil Island. He was a 69-year-old Eisenhower Republican, a Protestant who believed in divine providence, and he loathed cheaters. Jenny emphasized that to me over and over again. My dad hated cheaters. His law school clerks were all members of his college fraternity, Sigma Chi, and that's about as old school as it gets. And he was also well known to be an avid sport fisherman, relishing a day on the Pacific out of Ilwaco or Westport. Lester Stripmatter, who represented the Macaw, told his son Paul, a classmate of mine, he said, "We got a bad draw with this guy. He's no friend of Indians." Further, Boldt had ruled against the Cowlitz tribe a couple of years earlier in its attempt to prevent the city of Tacoma from building 2 dams. And in 1970 was the big case, the one that absolutely outraged the judge. 7 obstreperous young Vietnam War protesters arrived in his court. They were called the Seattle Seven, and they proceeded to make a mockery of Judge Boldt's courtroom decorum, staging guerrilla theater. They called him an old killer, declared that he was functioning as an arm of the fascist government, and he wasn't having any of that. After that tumultuous trial of the Seattle Seven, Boldt got a call from Richard M. Nixon. One of the ironies, as most of you know, is that Richard Nixon, for all of his duplicity and political machinations, turned out to be one of the best friends Native Americans ever had. He put an end to the era of closing out those treaties, of abrogating the treaties, ushered in self-determination. So when Nixon called, Judge Boldt accepted a job, and a thankless one at that, for 18 months, heading a scheme that Nixon had to head off inflation, and it was called the Pay Board. So George and Eloise Boldt decamped from Tacoma to Washington, D.C., and 18 months later, Nixon had decided that his poll numbers were high enough that he could end the Pay Board. And the Price Board, the stability, besides that, was getting a little controversial. So Boldt was really deeply disappointed. He was a real soldier, but he packed up. When he got back to Tacoma, the federal court, the Boldt case, the treaty rights case had been assigned to another judge, and Boldt said, "I want my case back. I want my case back." That's what he told Billy and Trova and I want my case back. What did he do? He immersed himself in pretrial reports and expert testimony on the Stevens-Palmer treaties. In the fall of 1973, I'm ashamed to say that I reduced George H. Boldt to sort of a caricature. For the Aberdeen Daily World, I described him as being bald, bow-tied, and no nonsense. Well, that was all true, but merely a superficial snapshot. What I should have known then is that if you can't judge a book by its cover, neither can you judge a judge by weighing a few facts and a few first impressions. After the Boldt decision, his detractors called him all sorts of names, most of them unprintable. They burned him in effigy, reviled him as a senile old Indian lover, but Boldt often described himself as a 4th of July man. A 4th of July man. He believed in American exceptionalism, but one of his proudest possessions was his father's naturalization certificate. With Ginny's help, plus reels of microfilm, 2 boxes of tape recorder batteries, I set out to tell who George Boldt really was. It was a magical mystery tour. There were revelations, outright surprises, and a slew of ironies and what might have beens. George Boldt, I learned, was the son of a Danish Swede who arrived in America in 1890 at the age of 17 and became a traveling salesman before finally achieving his ambition of becoming a dry goods store manager. Young George, born in Chicago in 1903, had a really choppy childhood, moving around. He survived life-threatening illnesses, and on the cover of the book, by the way, there's a mastoid infection scar down one whole side, left side of his neck. Mastoid infections in the 1920s were deadly. Children died of those infections before antibiotics. But we watched his parents' marriage fracture and lost his mother to appendicitis when he was 13 years old. And once, when he was under attack for his treaty rights decision, Judge Boldt called himself a pretty durable Dane. I really like that, a pretty durable Dane. I thought that might be a title, but when I heard about Lightning Bolt, it was irresistible. The durable Dane really fit. He was undeterred by criticism. He was really remarkably self-motivated, patriotic, brave. And during his childhood, he and his father, while the mother, for reasons the families never fully understood, had left George with his dad. After, for a while, by the way, George lived in San Francisco with his mother. Families are mysteries. These family mysteries are so fascinating, but George never once doubted that he was loved, that his parents loved him, even though they lived apart. Once, I was delighted to find out, thanks to Jenny's research, he lived in a boarding house together with a family of circus performers. And I can just imagine how entertaining that must have been to be 12 to watch people spinning plates on broomsticks and juggling. And whenever his dad was working late at the store, the circus people, and I think an opera singer as well, if I recall, Jenny, were looking after George. And the public library that was his refuge. Not one of those dents in his childhood really bumped his ambition. When his first grade teacher asked each of her pupils what they wanted to be when they grew up, George, without hesitation, replied, "A lawyer, a lawyer." I found out, besides being an exceptional all-around student while living in Illinois, he was a few miles from the site of the Lincoln-Douglas debates over the extension of slavery. And then something really magical happened. I learned that Judge Boldt spent those formative years in Montana. If you have not been to Montana's breathtakingly beautiful Bitterroot Valley, you really must go. It was in Stevensville, Montana, that George landed in 1918 with his dad as a sophomore in high school. Ed Eckley found something when he joined our team that really makes this book. George H. Boldt graduated from high school in Stevensville, Montana, which was named in honor of Isaac Stevens. The man who made the treaties, broke some before the ink was hardly dry. George, having lived in San Francisco and Chicago and bouncing around with his dad, must have seemed at 15 like the most worldly new kid in a town of about 1,200 people. But he really earned their respect quickly by immersing himself in every school activity there was. He started a school newspaper, a daily newspaper. It was a little sheet that he handed out. He was a debate champion. He was only about 5'7", perhaps 130 pounds soaking wet, and yet he helped tiny Stevensville win the state track meet in his senior year. He won an oratory contest, mentored young boys, was a stalwart in the church, and this is really delicious. In a high school minstrel show, and despite some of the racial connotations of all that, they were a popular amusement back in the 20s. George portrayed a black preacher who gave a rousing sermon about Gideon, the Old Testament judge of Israel and conflicted military hero. Ginny showed me a handbill early on from when her father was running for county prosecuting attorney and it said, "Vote for George Gid Boldt." And I said, "What's this Gid business?" Well, that was his nickname. Right after he gave the sermon, everyone, his high school classmates, college classmates, all through the University of Montana, he was Gid Boldt, or Gideon Boldt. And that performance was written up in the daily newspaper in Missoula, a big town up the road, so it really must have brought the house down. The most telling thing I learned in the Stevensville Historical Museum and in the archives of the University of Montana, that in Stevensville, George Boldt, at the age of 17, learned the heartbreaking story of the destitute Indian Salish Indians. They were cruelly displaced from their ancient homeland in 1891 in violation of earlier treaties and forced to move 60 miles north to the Flathead Reservation. Some historians in Montana call it the Salish Trail of Tears. College, worked his way through college, got some scholarships, arrives at the University of Montana, and George immediately becomes an intercollegiate debate champion and the absolute embodiment of school spirit. There's this picture. This is George Boldt, the old square, I thought. Here's the Yell King at the University of Montana, and the caption says, "School spirit raiser and voice culturer par excellence." This is George leading a chorus of Give 'em the Axe. And if you imagine Judge Boldt the way I saw him on the bench, in his bow tie, there's a bow tie, by the way. Maybe that's the genesis of the bow tie. But seeing George leading Give 'em the Axe, I just think is a hoot. My wife found this picture in the school annual, and it just was amazing. After he was the Yell King, he got elected student body president practically by acclamation. So the guy I thought was such an old fuddy-duddy square absolutely radiated charisma. After law school, he lands a job with the U.S. District Attorney in Helena. And in 1928, on one of the luckiest days of his life, he married a really remarkable woman named Eloise Baird. Her father was a leading Montana lumberman. They'd lived in Stevensville, and they matriculated at the University of Montana together. They waited, by the way, to get married, even to get engaged, until George had graduated from law school and found a permanent job. He landed a job quickly with a prominent Seattle law firm, and within a year, he made partner, and the Seattle Times hailed him as one of the most accomplished young attorneys in King County, winning headline-making cases. By the way, another word about Eloise Boldt. George and Eloise were absolutely inseparable for 65 years, except for World War II. And my favorite story is that George, the guy I thought was so conservative, what did he do for his honeymoon trip? He hired a crop duster in Spokane to take he and Ginny to Wenatchee, I think, and they put on leather helmets and goggles, and off they go in 1928. That's so delicious. By 1940, here we go, George is now Governor-elect Arthur B. Langley's top aide. He'd done some, there was in that 1940 election, by the way, was the closest one to date and has been surpassed only by the Gregoire Rossi election all those years later. But the ballots were heavily contested, and it was George who waded in on Governor-elect Langley's behalf and made sure he prevailed. So Langley hired him to settle the insurance claims over the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, Galloping Gertie. After the war, he also acquired the Blackball Ferry Line for the state. So he was pretty well entrenched by then. What happens on Pearl Harbor Day? George Boldt's 38 years old, father of 3 young children, and exempt from the draft. His worried wife said, "You don't have to enlist. We need you here. The kids are young." He assured her he did have to enlist. He was an American and his country was at war. The Army snapped him up sent him off to command in General Staff School. And by 1943, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA, recruited Boldt for a super secret clandestine mission. The OSS sent him to the front lines of Burma for a very strategic war theater with a crossroads up into China. The Japanese were heavily embedded and were desperate to hold Burma. Boldt's counter-espionage and psychological warfare group was called the Boldt Team, and whole books have been written about their exploits, documentary films. There's one on YouTube if you really want to hoot. Jenny and I and Emily found that by happenstance on YouTube, one day I said, OSS Gold Dust Team, and all of a sudden we had a World War II propaganda film starring Judge Boldt on the front lines at Burma. Something really important happened in Burma. Judge Boldt's intelligence officer was a Japanese-American lieutenant from Hawaii. The interpreters that they needed were Japanese-American Nisei as well, including some Issei, first generation. They were absolutely essential to this effort to confusing the enemy. And had the Japanese-American soldiers been captured, they surely would have been tortured and beheaded as traitors to the mother country. As the war was winding down, Lieutenant Colonel Boldt led the first convoy into China over the reopened Burma Road. And the Pentagon declared that his team had achieved an array of, quote, outstanding successes in the surrender of enemy troops. They had also rescued 300 downed Allied airmen behind enemy lines, and Boldt said that was well worth the whole expenditure of time, effort, and money. So now it's 1953. Dwight D. Eisenhower has been elected as a Republican president. The Republicans have control of a lot of patronage, excuse me, for the first time since the coming of the New Deal in 1943. And one of the seats that was open was a seat, an appointment to the federal bench in Tacoma. The other leading contender was Congressman Thor Tollefson, a Tacoma Republican who served on the House Fisheries Commission. The Tollefsons were really well-known and substantial people here in Tacoma, good people. Like Boldt, Tollefson was a strong supporter of Governor Langley and President Eisenhower, but it was Boldt who won Langley's endorsement, and his war record and decorum really sealed the deal when he spent 20 minutes with President Eisenhower. Another of these ironies that came up in this complicated story is that 21 years later, George Boldt and Thor Tollefson would square off again, but this time, Thor Tollefson was Washington's director of fisheries, and George Boldt was a federal judge. Thor Tollefson was no bigot, but he minced no words about the Boldt decision. It was absolutely clear from day one that if he had been on the federal bench, there would have been no decision upholding the sovereignty of the treaty tribes. History is replete with these what might have beens. Most famously, when Boldt picked Lincoln's birthday to release his landmark decision, it really wasn't the first time that he had chosen Lincoln's birthday to make a statement about civil rights and about civility and the rule of law. While serving with those Japanese Americans with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Burma, Boldt wrote a letter to his wife. Thank you again, Jenny, for saving these. He wrote a letter to Eloise that said he was ashamed to say that after Pearl Harbor, his ideas about Japanese Americans were, quote, utterly wrong, misguided, cruel, and shameful. And this is what he wrote. Nisei soldiers have been given the toughest, dirtiest, and most hazardous jobs in the war. Their record in combat is equaled by few and excelled by none. I know many, many other Americans who are not fit to be mentioned in the same breath with them. When I get back home, one of my first post-war projects is going to be to do everything within my power to destroy this bigotry and to fight for the decent treatment and rights of these Americans whose fathers, like mine, we're immigrants to a land where racial prejudice has no proper place. Where racial prejudice has no proper place. George Boldt was as good as his word. Lincoln's birthday, 1946, February 12th, he began giving a series of speeches to service clubs and veterans organizations in Tacoma, Seattle. In each, he praised the Nisei soldiers and denounced racism as, quote, virulently un-American. Virulently un-American. The Seattle Times led its editorial page with a column praising Boldt's message of tolerance. Well, I've had so many fabulous experiences in all these years as a journalist and historian, but it was an amazing coincidence that having covered the Quinault Nation since 1966, I got a call from Guy McMine's Big Butch, who said, you need to be in the courtroom when Dela Cruz and I and Horton Kopelman, a Shaker bishop, were going to testify on behalf of the Quinaults. And it turned out to be one of the most pivotal days in the treaty rights trial. It was a rainy day in the fall of 1973, and I was also there to hear the person I believe is the linchpin to the Boldt decision, a remarkable anthropologist. And I realized right then that the state of Washington was behind the 8 ball. Attorney General Slade Gorton, who famously opposed the Boldt decision, told me years later that the state's bifurcated defense was at best problematic. The Fisheries Department conceded that the Indians deserved a specific share of the resource, but it was unprepared, in truth reluctant to say just how big a share. And the Game Department maintained that steelhead, in keeping with state law, were to be caught only for sport. We had 2 conflicting legal arguments. Ed Mackey, one of Gorton's top deputies, told me last year as I was looking through 4,600 pages of the trial transcript. Particularly striking to courtroom observers was Boldt's attentiveness to the testimony of the Indian elders. Al Zients, who represented the Makah tribe, how I wish Al were with us, said he knew things were going really well because Boldt was so engaged. I watched his expression as the Indians paraded before him up to the witness stand and spoke. Zients remembered, when Indians speak, you listen, because they speak gravely and from the heart and with very little falderall and curlicues. It's very blunt, it's very factual. I think of your dad again, Willie. Judge Boldt listened intently and he absorbed what they had to say. He leaned forward, often just sort of craning his ear to make sure he was hearing. What they told him, Zients said, was a story of oppression by our lovely state of Washington, the state I had fallen in love with and thought was so progressive and non-prejudicial. The Indians had something, the whites wanted it, the whites took it. So as persuasive as these tribal witnesses were, and Guy McMine's absolutely delivered a pivotal moment when he assured the judge in written testimony, in an oral testimony, that the Quinaults and the Yakimas, to name 2, had acquired such professional skills, highly skilled biologists, fully capable of co-managing the resources. The star witness that I mentioned, unquestionably, was Dr. Barbara Savatkin Lane, the Northwest leading anthropologist. Mason Morissette, Michael Taylor of the Quinaults, Stuart Pearson, one of the key state attorneys, Ed Johnstone, Pearl Kopelman Ballard, Chris Peters, to name a few, would second my motion about Barbara. With 20 years of wide-ranging field work after earning a doctorate at the University of Washington, Dr. Lane had painstakingly documented the livelihoods and spiritual practices of Northwest Coast indigenous people, from Vancouver Island to Celilo Falls. Fish, as the Yakima put it so well at the Treaty Council, were their lifeblood. Dr. Lane had something else. She had res cred, as I'd call it. In addition to her impeccable academic credentials, She lived among the Quinaults. She lived among the Puyallups and Nisquallies. She'd watched basket makers and canoe carvers and documented their every move for posterity. She'd earned their trust and abiding admiration. When I set out to write a biography of Boldt, I also wanted to know a lot more about Barbara Lane. What I discovered was riveting. I discovered that her grandparents were Jewish refugees who'd come to America to escape the anti-Semitism that swept the Russian Empire in the 1880s. It was easy to see then what the wellspring of her lifelong empathy with marginalized people was. She was one of you. She understood. What I knew in 1973, though, was that she was just witheringly bright. The state's attorneys and witnesses tried to discount her testimony every way they could. Judge Boldt's disdain for their tactics was palpable. He all but kicked the state's own hapless anthropologist right out of the courtroom when the hapless guy kept giving evasive answers. It really is embarrassing to read. But in her own time on the witness stand, Dr. Lane carefully reiterated the thrust of her reports on the complexities of the treaty councils. What was a key problem, she emphasized, was that the tribe spoke dozens of languages. Unless he were bilingual, she testified, a Quinault speaker could no more understand a Quileute speaker than an English-speaking person could understand Finnish. And Chinook jargon, the trade language used by the translators of the treaty talks, had only a limited vocabulary. Still, she said, it would have been possible to convey the general meaning of the treaty language, except that many, if not most of those present, didn't even understand Chinook jargon. The same word had multiple meanings. But whenever the talks grew tedious, Lane said that the tribal leaders stiffened their shoulders and unmistakably said this: they wanted to fish where they'd always fished. They'd wanted to fish where they'd always fished. It took me 50 years to get in print my all-time favorite moment from the Boldt Treaty Rights trial. My editors at the Aberdeen Daily World in 1973 certainly weren't going to print one of Joe Delacruz's classically earthy commentaries on Isaac Stevens' integrity. They chuckled in appreciation, but said the quote he'd given me was still too vulgar for, quote, a family newspaper. Well, vulgar or not, here you go. I was outside the federal courthouse during a break in the proceedings when Delacruz sidled up next to me. He lit a Marlboro with his chrome Zippo, inhaled deeply, looked at me and said, unfortunately, there's no word for bullshit in Chinook jargon. Unfortunately, there's no word for bullshit in Chinook jargon. I still think that was absolutely classic Joe Delacruz, cutting the chase of everything. And Barbara Lane, bless her heart, could also spot BS at 100 paces. She soon grew impatient with the tedious questions defense attorneys kept asking her. They were trying to undermine her allegedly over-formulated testimony. Do you understand my position? A defense attorney prodded. Do you understand my position, Dr. Lane? I understand what you've said to me, she said. I don't understand what your problem is. That one just jumped off the page. The murmurs of appreciation in that courtroom just rippled among the spectators. At the end, I've seen Judge Boldt's copy of Dr. Lane's 2-volume documentation of her research, and they were well worn by before the trial was over. Fish meant everything to the tribes, Lane testifying, and the whites knew it. When hostilities broke out on both sides of the Cascades in 1855, according to some accounts, U.S. Army troops reportedly seized traditional Indian fishing grounds to cut off their lifeblood. Here's what Lane wrote. It was the clear and unequivocal intent and understanding on the part of both Indians and whites at the treaty signing that the reservations were to be residential bases from which the Indians were to continue to utilize the total environment, including specifically all of their fishing locations, in order to maintain themselves and to contribute to the economy of the entire population. Also, it was clear that there was no intention of creating a class society with Indians on the bottom economic rung. The Treaty Commission clearly undertook to provide the Indians with a means of participating and prospering in the economy of the territory. So what did Judge Boldt decide? He weighed all that, and he memorably concluded that the treaty tribes were entitled to up to 50% of the catch at all usual and accustomed places, in common with citizens of the territory. At all usual and accustomed places, in common with citizens of the territory. Lord knows how that was translated in multiple dialects, multiple languages, in Chinook jargon. But again, what did the Indians know? In common with and in usual and accustomed places meant they wanted to fish where they'd always fished. Dr. Lane's exceptionally well-researched reports played a key role in his decision, Boldt wrote. That's his quote, exceptionally well-researched. The reports were authoritative and reliable summaries of all relevant aspects of Indian life in the 1850s, including the Treaty Council, he wrote. There was no credible evidence the Indians understood or intended ever that their fishing rights would or ever could authorize the citizens of Washington Territory or any future state government to restrict or in any way interfere with the full exercise of those rights. That's what the man said. All the evidence cited by Dr. Lane was overwhelmingly to the contrary, the judge wrote, particularly the documentation that the Indians insist upon retaining the exercise of those rights as essential to their very survival. Further, they had been given unqualified assurance of that by Governor Stevens himself without any suggestion that the Indians' exercise of those rights might someday, without authorization of Congress, be subjected to regulation by non-Indian citizens through their territorial or state government. Barbara Lane died in 2013. Her passing was largely unheralded in the mainstream media, which seems to be the way she wanted it. She was in a lot of ways a private person. Fittingly, the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission and tribal newsletters around the Northwest hailed her as a towering figure in the fight for treaty rights and indigenous peoples' sovereignty. I believe she deserves a book of her own, perhaps a statue as well, or at very least, I would urge you all in this community of sovereign nations to consider a substantial scholarship named in her honor. I'm sure she would prefer that it go to a tribal student studying anthropology or the law. Billy Frank would be the first to agree. What happened with the Boldt decision? I remember it as if it were yesterday. The outcry from non-Indian fishermen was loud and instantaneous. Fearing bankruptcy, gillnetters and purse seiners descended on Olympia to demand relief. Don't whites have rights? One of the many signs and banners asked, and then we have this boat decorated with "Shove It Boldt" on the, I think it's ironic and telling that this guy couldn't spell shove. Non-Indian and proud of it, land of the free and home of the braves. Well, reverse discrimination, they said. How could it be right toward 50? How could it be right? How could it be right to award 50% of the fish to less than 1% of the population? Never mind what the treaty said. Steelheaders were outraged that their prized game fish could be fished commercially. Charter boat operators said their livelihoods and the health of fishing towns were imperiled. And Boldt, he seldom responded to the personal attacks. He was really a witty, self-assured man. He could laugh about some of the buttons and the bumper stickers, including one he really liked that said, "Save our salmon can, Judge Boldt." In my collection, I have this wonderful button here, "You've just been screwed by a bolt without a head." What he had not anticipated was the violence that broke out when state officials clumsily enforced his order, closing fishing grounds to non-Indian commercial fishermen. What did he say? It came as a shock that the vast majority of Washington residents, at least those that fish, don't give a damn about Indian rights, Boldt said. Washingtonians need to learn the facts about what happened in the 1850s, he said, when the federal government set out to extinguish Indian land claims. And the Indians, someone murmured. We know the rest of the story, at least where we are today, because we're living it. And despite the challenges, we're a lot better off. There's consensus now in cooperation. The Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, trained biologists, wise managers, co-managers of the resource. There's a realization by most right-minded Washingtonians that we're all in this together, despite the climate change deniers. No more bullets and tear gas canisters. So there's still that undercurrent of racism that you all know about. But there's backsliding, and there's denial and obstructionism, as well as debates over what kind of return we're getting on our multi-million-dollar investments. As fish barrier culverts are being removed along the state's roads and bridges, the debate over breaching the dams on the Columbian Snake has intensified. Climate change has shriveled glaciers and snowpacks, raising the temperature of rivers and boosting ocean acidity. Predation is rampant, whether it's cormorants, seals, sea lions. Higher levels of carbon dioxide impact the way salmon use their sense of smell to find food, avoid being eaten, find their natal streams. And fewer salmon also jeopardize the survival of other species in the marine food chain, including the endangered southern resident orca. Linda Mapes, the extraordinary environmental reporter for the Times, notes that most scientists ascribe the decline of Pacific salmon to the 4 H's. There's habitat, destruction, hatcheries, hydropower dams, and overharvest. Some people would add a fifth H, hubris. People, except for the Indians, have always thought they could outstrip and outsmart nature. We should really close on a hopeful note today. We'll remembering Judge Boldt's wit and humor, his optimism and humility. I love this portrait that his grandson Jeff took. I think this is a family event in the 1980s. Emily, when I first met Emily, I said, "What was your grandfather like?" And she said, "He was joyful. He was a joyful man." And we usually see him depicted as somber, sometimes scowling or perplexed, but that smile was radiant, and his humor was mischievous. When a promising young man named Tom Reedinger asked Boldt for his daughter Jenny's hand in marriage, the judge reached out, shook his hand, and replied with a wink, "Okay, but just remember, you can't give her back." One day during the treaty rights trial, and many of us remember as one of the highlights, 2 of the Northwest's leading steelheaders testified that with all due respect to salmon, steelhead were a special fish. Capable of leaping 6 feet out of the water, they put up more of a fight. It was marvelous. Catching one guy said, requires total concentration and a delicate touch. You wouldn't know if you've never done it, he said. The thrill of landing such a dynamic fish drew sportsmen from all over the world to the Northwest, they testified. And because steelheading offered a greater sense of commune with nature, he said, if you've ever made love, I guess that's about the nearest I can express it. If you've ever, in the courtroom was electric then, if you've ever made love, I guess that's about the nearest I can express it. Boldt smiled and we chuckled, and the fisherman beamed then as he recited his favorite rivers, the Skagit, the Stillaguamish, the Skokomish, the Green, the Puyallup, the Squally, Cowlitz, Bogachiel, Hole, Sulduck, and Hup Tulips. And Judge Boldt leaned forward and says, "That doesn't give you much time for making love, does it?" And credit to Steelheader. He says, "You have to sandwich it in." It was a lovely moment. But the last word, as I mentioned in the beginning, rightfully belongs to Justice Black, who summed up everything George H. Boldt believed to his dying breath. Great nations, like great men, should keep their word. Great nations, like great men, should keep their word. And that's what he did. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now here's Ed.
Yes. Great job. All right. Well, thank you all, and I'm not looking forward to following that because excellent job, John. Thank you for doing that. All right. Well, a little bit about this sister project that we worked on along with Boldt's biography, Confluence here. So, I joined Legacy Washington. Oh, I'm a little ahead on the slides there. I joined Legacy Washington almost a year ago. We're part of Washington State Archives, and our mission is capturing the stories that shaped Washington's political landscape. We record and share the memories that give context to the documents and ephemera that are housed in our public collections. This was my first project with this wonderful team, which includes, in addition to John and myself, senior researcher Aaron Poplowski. He's downstairs selling books today.
Hopefully a lot.
Hopefully a lot. Archivist Ben Helly, who you'll see around today, moonlighting as a photographer. And Amber Rainey, All Foundation Administrator. The All Foundation is our 501c3 arm that funds production of our books and exhibits, as well as State Library and the Washington Talking Book and Braille Library, which are all under the Secretary of State. By the way, donations are fully tax deductible, just saying. At the outset of this project, we envisioned one book, although it became clear very quickly that 2 publications would work better. Given the scope and complexity of the stories involved, when we began, we cast a wide net to capture and share different and yet complementary perspectives on the Boldt decision and the years following. Through John's contacts, and with the help of others, especially Pagan Frank, thank you, Pagan, and at Salmon Defense, and Carrie Newmeyer at Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, we connected with folks from across the region who experienced the controversies and challenges stemming from the decision firsthand. From these, we identified 5 individuals whose connections to this issue give readers insights to different aspects of the larger story. Our goal was to help readers get a sense of the magnitude and complexity of this issue through the voices of those who experienced it. Ed Johnstone grew up surrounded by family and friends whose lives centered on salmon. His deep roots in Washington's Pacific Coast tribal communities gave him an early awareness of the importance of the resource management to his people. Among Ed's most important influences was his older brother, Guy McMines. Big Butch, as he was known, earned a degree in fish management at UW, where he connected with other like-minded Native Americans intent on defending treaty rights and bringing scientific practices of salmon management back to their communities. Ed was also mentored by activist Hank Adams, another Quinault resident, as well as Tribal Chair Joe Dela Cruz. While still a teenager, Ed shuttled supplies to support them as they blockaded the Chow Chow Bridge to stop destructive logging on Quinault lands. Since that time, Ed became increasingly engaged in policy making and negotiations required in collaborative resource management. By the time he began serving at the Fisheries Commission, Ed knew he was part of his mentor's succession plans. He was appointed as chair in 2021 following the passing of Lorraine Loomis, who had succeeded Billy Frank Jr. The decades of mentorship Ed received from his parents, grandparents, family, especially his brother Guy, and many others, clearly animates his work today. Ed brings this deep knowledge and commitment to his work, bridging new generations of salmon advocates to those who began the fight. Mason Morissette, who's with us today, was raised in Astoria, Oregon. He began his working life gutting salmon in a cannery on the lower Columbia. A standout in high school, he earned his law degree at UC Berkeley. Surrounded by and inspired by activists, Morissette jumped at a chance to work for Al Zions in Seattle, defending Native treaty rights. From then on, that was his life. After supporting Zions in US v. Washington, subsequent cases became Mason's responsibility. In his words, the sub-proceedings were endless, and the state's legal teams did everything in their power to overturn the Boldt ruling. In 1979, the issue reached the US Supreme Court, where Mason faced off with Washington Attorney General Slade Gorton. The justices, as we know, sided with the tribes. The treaties meant what they said. Mason still represents tribes in courts to this day, helping new generations of business leaders, government officials see the light when it comes to treaty rights, usually in court. As Mason often says, just because it's old doesn't end the promise. A self-described rough country girl, Charlene Christ spent her early years fishing, gathering shellfish, and working in the berry fields with her extended family. Her awareness of the larger political forces at play began when she saw a protest on the state capitol grounds as she and her mother passed by on a bus. "They're fighting for our rights," her mother told her. After the Boldt decision, her family joined other Squaxin families as they took up commercial fishing. On the water, they faced harassment and threats. Confrontations with non-native fishermen and tidelands owners were a frequent part of a day's work on the water. Fishing also requires patience. The downtime that Charlene gave Charlene the opportunity to learn family and tribal history from her elders. She learned there were troops stationed near Squaxin Island during the 1855-56 Treaty War. Their job was to keep Indian people from leaving the island. By the 1980s, Charlene was distraught over declining salmon runs. Clear-cut logging and encroaching development were threatening the land and her community. Encouraged by her family, she became a liaison between the Squaxin people and local governments, advocating for tribal participation and collaborative decision-making. Charlene still serves the Squaxin people in many ways. As the executive director of the Squaxin Island Museum, she and her staff are the keeper of the stories. As a side note, I'm also pleased that this project will have an additional benefit. I'll be working with Charlene, looking forward to this very much, to help train a few new oral historians at their amazing museum. Thanks. All right, many of you know Jim Waldo, who graciously agreed to be part of this project, which I'm very grateful. His life work is helping adversaries bridge seemingly insurmountable differences. Those of you who know him understand he has a gift for calming tensions while keeping folks on track to get things done. Raised in Seattle, Jim's father was an attorney. His mother was active in civil rights issues, which makes a lot of sense if you know Jim. Jim was drawn to politics from an early age. In college, he supported Dan Evans' run for governor and later worked for his administration. After earning his law degree, Jim worked for OSHA in Washington, D.C. Early on, Jim showed an acuity for creative solutions in difficult circumstances. Excuse me. In 1976, Jim returned to Seattle, recruited by U.S. District Attorney Stan Pitkin to help sort out the tsunami of litigation following the Boldt decision. After Boldt was affirmed by the Supreme Court in 1979, Jim met with business leaders to find a new way forward. Working with Billy Frank Jr. and other Native leaders, a meeting was held in Seattle between tribes and business leaders. Tensions ran high in the room. Forced to deal with one another face to face, the ice began to thaw. From there, additional meetings were scheduled, the beginnings of collaboration. A new course by state fisheries managers also opened the way forward. State Fisheries Director Bill Wilkerson met with Jim and Billy Frank and organized another summit, this time at Port Ludlow. In March 1984, 40 years ago this month, by the way, tribal leaders and state officials warily mingled, and again, the ice began to thaw. Hailed now as the beginning of collaborative management, these meetings were the turning point where Jim and Billy's team began to make real headway, bringing together individuals, businesses, government, and others to address problems outside the court to the extent possible. As the current chair, whoops, got ahead of myself there. As the current chair of the University of Washington Center for Urban Waters, Jim continues this work, mentoring new generations of problem solvers. When asked, Jim will tell you patience and perseverance are the key. But it all starts with sitting down and, in his words, breaking bread together. All right, now we're to Katie. Like the others featured in this book, Katie Bizalova, I practiced this. Bizova, Katie B.
There you go.
Yeah. Exuded the enthusiasm of someone who is committed to a mission. At a young age, it was wonderful to sit down with all of these people. Katie was just so kind to have us visit Stillaguamish. At a young age, she moved to Stillaguamish with her parents to begin reconnecting with her tribe. As an outsider, she initially felt tested, in her words, by her new community to determine her sincerity, to make sure she understood and valued traditions that were central to their lives. When circumstances beyond her control eliminated healthcare as a career option, she took an admin job at the Stillaguamish Department of Natural Resources. There she began working closely with longtime Stillaguamish fisheries manager Sean Yannity, who also served on the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. Accompanying Sean to meetings, Katie gained an understanding of the urgency of the need for collaborative resource management. She also learned the Stillaguamish people, like tribes across the region, weren't the newcomers to the field. Respect for salmon and the environment that sustains them is ingrained, the fabric of their culture. Over time, she absorbed the stories of those who fought for treaty rights to preserve their heritage as stewards of the land. In her words, she peppered Sean with questions following each meeting. Before long, Sean recognized he had found someone who understood the cause and the stakes. After Sean's retirement, Katie became director of Stillaguamish DNR. She also succeeded him at the Fisheries Commission and has been elected to the Stillaguamish Tribal Council. Katie's commitment to educating others and to the cause she inherited is illustrative of the energy that the next generation of Native leaders brings to the table. Her passion for the cause is palpable and inspires hope. It is the kind of energy needed to address the challenges coming our way. In closing, I want to add that we feel very honored to learn these stories and be able to meet and get to know a little bit everyone we interviewed. We are forever grateful to them for sharing their time and trusting us with these memories. Confluence, along with Lightning Bolt, are intended to be companion pieces to Trova Heffernan's 2012 biography of Billy Frank Jr. Together, we hope they offer a gateway to readers looking for a wider understanding of the many key people and events that make up this complex, ongoing story. As part of the state archives, one of the benefits of our work at Legacy Washington is the raw interview recordings, transcripts, photos, and other research we gather become part of the state archives collection for future researchers to access. I bring this up because, of course, history is never done. It's our expectation these works inspire people to dig deeper, to learn more about the Boldt Decision's wide impact as we gather and share, gather gather and share their own stories. Thank you. All right. Yes. Yep.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Ed. So we have a little bit of time until the next our next program starts. I want to encourage you, if you haven't been up to the 5th floor, one floor up, to visit the Treaty of Medicine Creek. The page that we have from the treaty includes the article which is specific to the reservation of fishing rights. Across from that, we have an exhibit about the Boldt Decision and about the fish wars. One thing you'll note if you go into that exhibit is the wars didn't stop with the Boldt Decision. There's a list of cases that have happened since then that continue to be seen in the courts to reinforce and uphold fishing rights in Washington State and across the United States. So I encourage you to check that out. A lot of the books that are mentioned here are available in the gift shop and also by at the Legacy Washington table. And then finally, I'm going to end on an anecdote that it's a story that I never get to tell, but I'm going to tell it because it just feels like in the spirit of the day. I had the honor of meeting Billy Frank Jr. once. And I was in Washington, D.C. at the time. I was also having the honor of attending the inauguration of President Obama. And I was at an event, like a pre-party, right? And Billy Frank Jr. was there, and I went up to speak with him, and he said, we were talking about something. He said, "Well, I'm getting honored tonight." He was getting a big award, and I can't remember what it was, but it was from a national organization. And I said, "Well, when is that?" He said, "Oh, it's 7 o'clock." I said, "Sir, it's 8 o'clock. You need to get going." And he just laughed at me and he said, "Well, I don't think they'll start without me." Unless you are on our panel of speakers, we will start without you at 2 o'clock down in the auditorium, down on our 2nd floor. So we will see you at 2 o'clock to hear from our tribal leaders about the legacy of the Boldt Decision. Thank you.